This episode of the Doctor's Corner is brought to you by the 2020 U.S. Census.
Hello, this is Dallas City Councilman Casey Thomas, and I want to talk with you about the most important thing this year. No, not the 2020 presidential election, but the 2020 census. Every 10 years, we are required by the U.S. Constitution to complete the census. This census count will determine how federal dollars are spent in local communities for the next 10 years. Millions of dollars for our community centers, libraries, and other community programs are allocated based on the census count. This year is the first time ever that you will be able to complete the census online. You can complete it by phone, online, or have someone come to your house and have you to fill it out. It's 10 questions and only takes a few minutes of your time. Once again, this is Casey Thomas of the Dallas City Council. If you don't count, then you don't matter.
Well, hello, podcast listeners. Welcome to the Doctor's Corner, where we acknowledge this nation's military and veteran population and encourage nationwide literacy. I am your host, Dr. K, and you guessed it, I am a proud United States Navy veteran. Today, we have a very special episode for your listening pleasure. But first, let me explain to our first-time listeners. On the Doctor's Corner, we select various literary compilations from a wide variety of genres and share with you our subjective evaluation of whether it was a 5-star compelling read, a 3-star average read, or a 1-star, a less than compelling read. On the Doctor's Corner, we understand that a quality literature review is not about the author, with the exception of biopics and memoirs and biographies, but more so about the content, the writing, the storyline, the navigation of the topics, the characters, the research, and on the facts. On the Doctor's Corner, we hope to augment this nation's reading levels of U.S. adults, as well as bring an awareness of our military members and veterans who are serving or who have served. On today's show, we happen to have a veteran who is an author, retired Navy captain and author, Marc Liebman. Welcome to the Doctor's Corner.
Well, welcome. I'm glad to be here. It's an honor.
Thank you. So tell TDC listeners a little bit about yourself and your military journey.
Well, I'm a retired Navy captain, and I was a naval aviator. I got my wings in 1969, so that makes me an old guy. And I was a helicopter pilot. I flew helicopters throughout my Navy career. I flew mostly combat search and rescue, a little special operations, and a little bit of anti-submarine warfare. So that is the flying part of my career. I also spent a fair amount of time as a staff officer and war planner on battle group staffs, as well as numbered fleet staffs, primarily 7th Fleet, which is home ported in Yokosuka, Japan.
I noticed a little bit of your writing had the USS Blue Ridge.
Oh, yes. We refer to it as the Blue Maru. And I've spent more than one night on the Blue Ridge.
So your journey as an author started well before this book that we're going to discuss, Moscow Airlift. When did you start writing and share why?
Okay, so my first novel was published in 2012. However, I first started trying to write novels back in the late 80s and early 90s of the last century. It sounds like a long time ago. And I failed miserably, and I didn't really know what I was doing, not that I do now. But I'm writing for 3 primary reasons. One is because I think I've got interesting in stories that for a reader to read, keep them up late at night at turning pages, so to speak. The second reason I write them is it's a way to write for the legacy of my children and my grandchildren. So they know a little bit about their grandfather, obviously their father if they're my kids, but also for generations to come. They'll know about their family history because I've put enough of it in there so that they can use it as a reference. And then the last thing I do is it's something I always wanted to do. Ever since I was in college, I wanted to be a novelist. It's as I tell people that when I retired from the business world, I could afford to be a novelist because it's not, unless you're lucky enough to be a John Grisham or a Tom Clancy, it is not a way to make money.
Wow. Okay. So in writing Moscow Airlift, who do you think your target audience is?
That's a great question. The flippant answer is anyone who likes a good spy thriller or espionage thriller. And I think that's probably generically true. But this one, in fact, all my books are targeted at people who enjoy not only the story, the espionage story, but learning about history, because my books are full of historical events and facts and fun figures that people don't normally include in historical novels. So from that perspective, the reader is going to want to enjoy learning about things that he never knows. The third thing that I always include in my novels is something that I've experienced in my life, which is anti-Semitism. And so there's always bits and pieces of that in there. And I treat it as neutrally as I can, but I also show it what the ugly thing it is.
Mm. So your personal journey in writing Moscow Airlift, are there any hidden truths in the pages, or is Moscow Airlift considered all fiction?
Oh, wow. Hidden truths. Yes.
Mm.
The book really is on 3 levels or 4 levels in terms of the plot threads. You have on one level, you have the discontent amongst the Russian intelligentsia, or nomenklatura, as they use the Russian term, but it's basically the leadership. They're uncomfortable because the country is literally spiraling out of control. So that's part one. The second part of this is a book about revenge. I won't tell you how and why, but the main character has had the thought of revenge simmering for 20 odd years after his first wife was killed by a KGB officer or a KGB assassin. The third level is, and this is where we're talking about hidden truth, is the plight of Soviet Jewry. In the Soviet Union, as well as in Tsarist Russia and even in today, anti-Semitism is almost built into the culture. It's the only country in the world where since Nazi Germany, where if you are born to Jewish parents or one parent, it says you're of Jewish origin in all your official documents, and they use it against you. So in this case, the story in the background is the story of the Bukharian Jews, which are actually Jews who live in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and those countries that border Iran, and they're primarily Muslim. And they're created by Stalin as a place to ship European Russians as well as many other peoples to kind of cross-pollinate the country to reduce ethnicity. And so in the 1970s, the Soviet Union began to sort of allow Jews to emigrate to Israel or to the United States or pretty much anywhere they wanted to go. You had to pay a tax that was pretty onerous, and particularly for somebody living in Russia, but also to the people outside who typically had to pay for it because you had to pay in US dollars or British pounds or Swiss francs. And so these people were trapped because they're generally poor. And over the past 10 or 15 years, or let's say early in the 21st century, they began to be allowed to emigrate. And at one time, there was about 500,000 in those 3 or 4 provinces. Today, there's about 15 or 20,000 of them left, mostly old, mostly infirm, or mostly not allowed to leave. And the rest have emigrated, again, to the United States, some to Israel, a lot into Central Europe, some to South Africa, and other countries that would take them. And they're known as Bukharin Jews. And again, that is a plot line. It's the third level. And then the fourth level is the corruption within the Soviet regime. You have a couple generals who want to fund their retirement by selling tactical nukes to the Iranians.
Do you believe what you wrote about in Moscow Airlift is relevant today?
Yes.
Oh, alrighty then. Okay.
So let me share with you what I mean about the historical context that drove the plot. There's six events in the year 1991 that are significant and that literally epitomize the problems that the Soviet Union had and why it fell apart. It literally into chaos in 1992, 1993, and why Putin ultimately emerged. I won't get into that part of it, but I'll talk about 91. On January 16th, 1991, Gorbachev and Bush signed a grain agreement that committed the Soviet Union to buy 8 million tons of U.S. grain a year. The reason why is because the country has historically not been able to feed itself. Its population had been growing at the rate of about 5% a year, and its ability to produce food was dropping at the rate of about 3 to 5% per year. So you had this divergence. And they were facing another famine, the likes of which they hadn't seen since the days of Stalin before World War II. So that was one thing. So that happened on January 16th. What also happened that night is a desert storm started. And of course, it went on through to February, early March. And in late March, on March 22nd, as a matter of fact, Gorbachev allowed a nationwide plebiscite to allow the Soviet people to vote whether they want to continue with the central control from Moscow and the Soviet Union or give more power to the individual states, the Soviet Socialist Republics, as they were known. And the population voted overwhelmingly, like 77%, in favor of dissolving the Soviet Union and giving more power to the individual states. So that happened in March. And all through this period, everybody heard about Glasnost and Perestroika, which were programs by Gorbachev to loosen up the Soviet economy, try to get consumer goods. But when he signed the agreement, he knew, and as did President Bush, that the Soviet Union could not pay for the grain. It was broke. In the Western term, the country was bankrupt. All of its gold reserves, by the way, or majority of them were sitting in London and in the United States, but that's another conversation. So all this discontent between the hardliners who didn't want to give up power and the people who wanted more power led to a coup led by the head of the KGB on August 19th. It failed ultimately, but it was in fact coup. Then, and in the midst of that, Yeltsin did his thing where he stood on a tank in Red Square and said, who is with me and all that kind of good stuff. But the fact of the matter is the coup failed. Then on August 24th of the year, the Warsaw Pact, even though it had been dead as a practical matter because all the nations had left, the treaty actually ended on the 24th of August. And then you fast forward to the 26th of December, midnight, the Soviet Union dissolves. Gorbachev is out of power. The Communist Party is out of power. And Yeltsin is now the president of the Russian Federation, and the rest, as we know, is history. So the book takes place essentially in January through September of 91 against this backdrop. And the problem we had, and this is based on knowledge when I was still active in the Navy, was the fact we didn't have a clue what was going on. We being the talking heads, the intelligence community, and I don't think even the people inside the Soviet Union really knew what was going to happen with all this turmoil. Yes, there are people like now say, yeah, I knew and all that kind of stuff, and to which I say BS, because it was literally out of control. And you had another force inside Russia, which is still powerful today. That's the Russian mafia. And they were grabbing property and power, and the oligarchs were grabbing businesses, industry, or factories. And so it was just a mess. Out of that emerged a strong man by the name of Vladimir Putin. But again, this backdrop is what we sent the hero into the Soviet Union to help be another set of eyes and ears for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and their operations group. And then he encounters what I call scope creep, because he meets a KGB general who is familiar with the assassination of his first wife. He gets involved in the sale of the nuclear weapons to the Iranians because they weren't confident they could do it themselves. So that's how the plot sits in the context of all those events.
And when you mentioned June of 1991, I was thinking, I was stepping into it because I joined the Navy in July of 1991. And no, I did not know all of that. You never really know what it is you're actually fighting for until you know what it is you're fighting for. So
it was really interesting because I was involved in Desert Storm in a big way at least for me and for what I did. I'm not talking about like General Schwarzkopf or President Bush, but I had a pretty significant role. But we in the military never know what we're going to deal with, and then the politicians set the rules of engagement, which often hinders what we can do. And they also, and again in the U.S. system, they set the objectives, and we in the military have to execute against those objectives. And to give you an example, in Desert Storm, we were told to evict the Iraqis from Kuwait. That was our mission, and the second part of our mission was to destroy the Iraqi army, or its military capabilities. And that's exactly what we did. Nothing in that set of military objectives given to us by the National Command Authority said anything about deposing Saddam Hussein or invading Iraq. Although we did, but it was done in part of the mission, and as soon as we finished the mission, we pulled out. And history will tell us that was a mistake.
Well, you said something pretty potent here when you said politics set the rule of engagement. I want to just read this excerpt that I just found profound. It's on page 33, and I want you to tell me what made you add this to Moscow Airlift. So let me just take a moment and read this. Islamic Jihad leaders were confident the Americans would be reluctant to shoot at what appeared to be a lost truck. This was essentially the same tactic the organization had used to destroy the U.S. Embassy in Beirut back in April. When Safdar had been designing and building the bomb, his contact had estimated it would take the Americans 10 to 20 seconds to realize they were in danger and react. By then, the truck should have crashed through the gate and be on its way to the main building.
Okay, the reason I wrote that was this. This was an example of how our enemy took advantage of our rules of engagement.
Wow.
Because we were on a, quote, peacekeeping mission, none of the rifles were loaded.
Wow.
So they had magazines, but they were not in the rifles. So keep in mind, here's a Marine standing guard, sees a truck coming at him, and by the time he realizes the truck is not going to stop, he's got to get out of the way, he's got to pull a magazine out, shove it in his rifle, put a round in the chamber, and pull the trigger. That takes time. So that's number one. Number two, they also knew our rules of engagement was to only shoot if engaged by somebody else. So it was back to Vietnam, where for years we were not allowed to shoot back unless we were shot at first. So those rules of engagement are typically not set by the commander in the field. They're set by somebody in a staff at much higher up, or generally in the Pentagon. And in today's world, it's set quite often by lawyers in the Pentagon who have no concept of what it's like to be on the front line. That's why that's in there. It's a stylized way, or an author's way of describing a situation in which we get people killed unnecessarily. Yeah. So today, if you read about things, particularly early in the Afghan war, when they tried to crash trucks through the barriers, the trucks were getting blown up. Why? Because they had anti-tank missiles, anti-armor rocket or weapon or whatever that's called law, and you fire it into the vehicle and it blows it up. And if it blows up outside the gate, it blows up outside the gate, and which is what you want. If it doesn't blow up outside the gate, well then okay. But so we've changed the rules of engagement to protect ourselves. But the Beirut bombing happened because of our rules of engagement. That was on Reagan and his Secretary of State.
Wow, that's significant information.
Yep.
So the plot, one of the plots, you mentioned 4, but one of the plots that kind of stuck out to me of the Moscow Airlift, it is action-packed, and the scenes navigate between chapters from Laos, California, New York, Beirut, Moscow, Israel, and help me with this one, Azerbaijan. So Chapter 4 introduces us to Captain Joshua Heyman, who served on board the USS Blue Ridge, which is still commissioned today. Captain Heyman exhibited what U.S. Armed Force members are trained to do in the interest of protecting this country while serving with fellow comrades. He sacrificed his wife, 16-year-old and 14-year-old daughter, and a 10-year-old son for a mission during Operation Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf. This entry depicts the very essence of what military members do every day. In Chapter 5, Leave No Man Behind, what does this chapter mean to you? Because it meant a lot to me when it comes to leaving no one behind. What did that mean to you?
You're talking about the rescue.
Yes.
Okay. So, again, my background is combat search and rescue. Our job is to go get the guys who get shot down. Period. End of statement. The United States is the only country in the world, with the possible exception of the Brits, who no longer really have the capability, and the French, who really don't have the capability, and the Israelis have capability within certain limits to go get their pilots when they're shot down, okay? Because the last thing we want them to do is be captured. So that was the whole idea, is that no matter what, we're going to go get the guy. Or we go try to get the guy. Sometimes, unfortunately, we don't succeed. So what this chapter had was a couple underlying things. If you know anything about the history of combat search and rescue, if you think back to Korea, and if you ever saw the movie The Bridges at Tokyo-ri, it's a wonderful depiction of the evolution of combat search and rescue during the Korean War and the tactics and doctrine that we used, and that are, by the way, still valid today. The equipment's changed, but the Navy's doctrine about when the guy gets shot down, we start vectoring assets to provide cover from the air to allow the helicopter or the rescue assets to get in. The Air Force doctrine is a little different. Took some pokes at the Air Force in that chapter. They want you to positively ID the guy, make sure of his location, and then they're going to launch. They're going to take somewhere between 24 and 72 hours before they launch. To me and to some of the other services, primarily the Marine Corps, that's just simply unacceptable. So during Desert Storm, because of the joint nature of the command, we had theoretically ceded, and I'm using that word CEDED, combat search and rescue, to the Air Force. When I got there, or when I was in the process before the war started, I was tasked to make sure that we had a Navy combat search and rescue capability, because we weren't going to wait 72 hours or 48 hours to go get the guy. If the guy went down, we were going to go get him. So we didn't have any assets, rescue assets in theater. In fact, all the rescue assets were in the reserve community. So what the Navy did as a stopgap measure was the same exact thing we did in 1965 during the beginning of the Vietnam War, which was stick M60 machine guns on in the doors of an H-3. No armor plate, no self-sealing tanks, just 2 M60 machine guns, and no training on how to do this.
Wow.
So needless to say, I arrived and I hit the feces hit the ceiling. We eventually got 8 of the combat SAR helos that were in the reserve community deployed to. 4 went into Jordan, and 4 came over to us, and we now had a CSAR capability with guys who knew what the hell they were doing. Mm-hmm. So that story was put in there as a message saying we cannot ever forget that at some point in time we may have to go get somebody, and we need to maintain our combat search and rescue capability, because between Korea and Vietnam, it went away. Mm-hmm. After Vietnam, it went away. We built it back up after the failed hostage rescue in 1980. We fell on our collective swords in Iran. And then today, the Navy is doing the same thing it did between Korea and Vietnam, and then Vietnam and Desert Storm. We're giving up for budgetary reasons our combat search and rescue capability, which now has a personal message because my son's an F-18 pilot, and there's nobody on the deck, the carrier deck, to go get them.
Wow.
Yeah, I had my heart in the mouth when he was flying missions over Afghanistan. Just a simple engine failure. It wouldn't be that disastrous, but if he had to punch out an airplane over Afghanistan or even over the Northwest Territories of Pakistan, he was in deep doo-doo.
Oh my. Interesting. Let's just hope the U.S. Armed Forces get this thing figured out in the interest of both of our sons. My son is in the U.S. Army. Let's go on to the next question. Mark, if you were to pick one character from Moscow Airlift that mostly resembles you, who would that be?
It's Josh Heyman, because the whole series of books, there'll be ultimately 7 books in the series. Do you know who Walter Mitty is?
No.
Okay, you ever heard of an author by the name of James Thurber?
No.
Thurber was a early 1900s author who wrote stories. He created a character by the name of Walter Mitty. And okay. Walter Mitty would go off and do heroic and wonderful things. Well, Josh Heyman is sort of my Walter Mitty, although he's got a really mean, nasty side to him that comes out in his book in ways that I surprised myself when I was writing it. But Josh Heyman, in many ways, is me. There are a lot of ways he's not, but there are many ways that he is.
Okay. So are you still working on your next book?
Yes. We're about halfway, two-thirds of the way through an Age of Sail book that's about the American Revolution. That should be out, I'm going to say the first half of this year. The 7th book in the Josh Heyman series should also be out later this year. It's written and sitting on. I am literally I have 3 more that are ready to go to a publisher, and I have about 6 or 7 more that I intend to write. Very
nice. Tell me a little bit about the cover of the book.
It was designed by Christine Horner, who's known as the Cover Whisperer. And I spent about 20 minutes telling her what the book is about, and she comes back with cover options. And it's actually a Russian church, because we figured that most people would recognize that as being Russian. Those are tank tracks, or supposed to be tank tracks. Snow.
Right.
And where she got the other elements, we have the typeface and the wings are common with all the books. But, like I said, that's where Christine came up with this idea. I have no idea.
Okay.
That's her.
Okay, never mind.
But if you look at all the covers, they're all pretty, when I say consistent, they're all attractive. I get lots of compliments about the covers.
Sure. Very nice. Another thing that I noticed is that it's military style. Everything is logged. Friday, September 28th, 1984. Wednesday, December 19th, 1990.
Yes, it's kind of like a log in a book, or like just like the log you'd have on a ship. Yes.
Yes, that's what that made me think of.
And guilty as charged. There's one thing that I would say about this book that I would recommend. If they buy it, go to the back of the book and read the historical context first. It starts on page 500, and read that first. When I originally submitted the manuscript, it was in the front of the book. Okay. The publisher said, "No, I want to put it in the back." Okay. He won. However, I've had 3 reviewers who've all said that should have been in the front of the book.
All right. Well, I have another question for you. What is a word of advice that you would offer to a young soldier or a sailor that is getting ready to join, or that have joined and haven't really spent that much time in the military? What would you say? Keep your eyes open, your ears open, and learn. Because the military will teach you a lot of things and teach you a lot of lessons. Very early on, one of the great things about the U.S. military, particularly the Navy, as you know, is that you get pushed even as a E4 into positions of leadership very early on. As a junior officer, I suddenly had a detachment with a helicopter, another pilot, and 12 enlisted guys, and I was responsible not only for the maintenance, but the operational employment of the helicopter, and I was 25 years old. So that's the first thing, is
Take it all in.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is you need to have a healthy BS filter. It's not that you're going to be lied to, but you're going to have to be able to determine for yourself what's real and what's Memorex.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're a young infantryman, okay, for example, and this is the example I give to everybody, the current practices of command and control are bad. Today, as you and I sit here in the comforts of our homes, there are probably 20 or 30 young 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old E5s running a checkpoint someplace in Afghanistan. This time of year, they're cold, so it's dark, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And in an instant, they have to make a decision whether that vehicle coming towards them is got a bomb in it or not. Or the woman and the two children walking towards her, she looks like she's pregnant, but is that a suicide vest?
Wow.
He or she has to, and these kids are, I use the word kids because I'm 74, these kids are 21 years old or younger. In an instant, that young man or woman has to make a decision that is literally not only life and death of his own, but of his comrades.
Right.
There's no time to pick up the phone and call back to a command center, because by the time you get an answer and you go through just all the normal crap that you have in a radio transmission, it's over. Okay,
Right.
so that's one instance. A second instance, that same squad leader is suddenly, in a firefight, and he's going to make a decision on how to employ his squad. And maybe his first sergeant's engaged in something else, he may be dead, he may be separated, but he is suddenly responsible for the lives of his section. Think about this: you were in an engine room, right?
Right.
You have a major engine. Let's say the ship has you're back in the bowels of the ship, and the ship has a collision. Alarms go off. This kind of stuff. So the DCA is not around, and you're in the compartment. And you're the senior petty officer on watch in the engine compartment, and you've got to figure out what to do.
Right.
Because it's literally a matter of the ship's survival that you keep propulsion going and power to the rest of the ship. The U.S. military is a great educational institution. Okay. And it teaches you lessons that you don't realize until you're 30 years old. But one of them is leadership. The other is responsibility, teamwork. But again, there's a lot of stuff that you hear and see that's just garbage.
Right.
And you filter it out.
Okay, I have a somber one for you, and this is one that I typically ask all veterans that participate in the show. The U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs reported that 6,000 veterans a year are killing themselves. And we have so many resources that we should not have to resort to random acts of violence or suicide. Why do you think this is happening? And what would you tell a comrade or a brother or sister in arms that is contemplating suicide?
Number one, it's the coward's way out. And nobody that I know who ever served in the military wants a C word associated with their name. This is an ugly, ugly conversation that you're going to hear a non-politically correct answer from me.
Okay.
Number one, I think the PC culture in the military is a lot to blame because everybody thinks they're a victim. And that's what the PC culture teaches people, is they're all victims. And the second thing is that we, the military, have done a piss poor job of identifying those soldiers and sailors and airmen who are in trouble psychologically. And I don't know, but the trouble is I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know how to identify these people except by doing more screening at the end of their commitments. So as they come out at the end of their enlistment, you run through a battery of psychological tests. It's the only way I know how to do that, or you go through a bunch of screening interviews, but that requires thousands of new psychologists. And I don't think that's the right answer either. I think part of it is a fair amount of guilt, survivor's guilt. My dad and I used to talk about this occasionally. So he was a bomber pilot during World War II. And so he's flying in a formation with, 50 other bombers, medium bombers.
Okay.
And the airplane next to him blows up, gets hit by flak. He keeps trucking along. He survives. Okay. You're standing there in a foxhole and a stream of machine gun bullets, misses you but hits the guy next to you. So the randomness of combat causes survivor's guilt because why is it not me? Because my best friend just died.
Right.
So that's the second thing is that we in the military don't deal with grief well. Because we all, the whole idea is, our friend has just died and you're going to continue on with the mission. Well, that's part of it, okay? But at the end, you still have to deal with the fact that your friend is gone.
Right.
And I think we need to find better ways to deal with grief, both short-term and long-term. I mean, I go to the wall in D.C. I have 6 friends who are on the wall, and 2 of them are pretty good friends. Met them both in the training command. And there's a fair amount of guilt as to why. I mean, let me give you an example where I have guilt that bothers me, and I try to joke about it, but it's not funny.
Sure.
I was a maintenance officer at a helicopter detachment. We had 4 helicopters, and I came back from a logistics flight, and I don't remember what I did or whatever. And I sat as we sat down on the deck, the air boss said, "Hey, we got another mission for you." And I said, "Well, we got to get some gas and swap out the crews because we've been flying for 6 hours." And he said, "Permission granted." So another crew comes up, we swap it out, and I say to the guy, the new aircraft commander, I said, "Hey, we got a tail rotor vibration," and I said, "I'd like to shut it down, take a look at the tail rotor, and see and grease it. It'll take 2 or 3 minutes. We can do it while we're refueling, but we'd have to shut the rotors down." He says, "Nah, don't worry. We'll take care of it when we get back." He takes off, gets about 500 yards from the ship, and the tail rotor comes off.
Oh, wow.
Thankfully, everybody got out. But as a maintenance officer, I could have downed the helicopter, and I probably should have, because my instincts told me that it was bad. But helicopters vibrate and they shake, and they all have vibrations, and it wasn't that bad. And I knew he was just going like a couple miles to go pick something up, and then he'd get some gas. We'd shut it down anyway. So we all get guilt from survivor's guilt. So that's number one. The second thing I think that goes along with that is that when I say we don't grieve, we tend to hold it in.
Right.
We think it's weak to talk about it. It's weak to cry.
Right.
No, it's not. It's okay.
It actually makes you feel better.
Well, not only makes you feel better, it makes you more effective because you're not weighed down by the emotional burden.
Sure.
But in the Navy, you've probably heard the term non-hacker.
No.
Oh, you never heard this term?
Mm-mm.
Okay. So a non-hacker is somebody who can't get it done, is just struggling. All right. So if somebody says you're a non-hacker, that means you're not up to speed. You're not pulling your own weight. Nobody in the military would ever wants to be known as that way. So if you want to have a couple hours off to go sit in a room and cry over somebody and deal with it, or go to a chaplain and do that, that's seen as not being the tough,
right, strong.
And no, it's not. It's not a sign of weakness. I say this now at age 74, but when I was in my 20s, ask my wife. I didn't know how to grieve. I didn't know how to grieve. I stand to this day. I did not know how to grieve over my mother's funeral, over my mother's grave when she died at 52, and I was in my 30s. Okay, wow. I didn't know how, and so I come back to summarize. I think it's one, we don't allow ourselves the time to grieve.
Sure.
Sometimes you don't have time, but you can always make time. Number 2, we don't know how. And number 3, it's seen as a weakness. But the fact that we're losing, what did you say, 6,000 a day?
6,000 a year.
A year.
Across the nation. Across the nation.
500 a month.
Yes, it's unbelievable. And we have, like I said, we have so many resources. But
don't get me started on the VA.
No comment.
Yeah. You're a public servant.
Well, what a history lesson I learned today. Thank you. Thank you so much, Marc, because if we don't recognize and acknowledge our history, we're bound to repeat it. So thank you for that, because I learned a lot. I really did. Yep. Well, tell me this. Look, because